I mean, it certainly looks that's a big question. Obviously, it looks very difficult at the moment, but things have looked difficult for prime ministers in the past. I mean, Boris went on a lot longer that I think after the original party stuff broke in the press, and it took an issue like the resignation of Chris Pincher to topple him. Theresa May, if you'd have said after the 2017 election, you're going to govern for 2 more years, everyone would have sort of been slightly incredulous at the thought of that at the time. This is unbelievable to make that prediction. So I guess I'm going to sit on the fence a little bit.
Most of your time is about getting legislation through and beating the opposition. What happens when the opposition is internally, and what you're actually doing is, it's not, do you agree with this tax policy or this housing reform, but it's, do you want the Prime Minister to continue? Presumably that's a whole new spreadsheet, and keeping tabs on who can see that is presumably quite important, because you don't want there being 10 rebels on I don't know, some environmental laws is one thing. There being 10, 15, 20 people who want the Prime Minister out is a different thing altogether.
Yes and no, because frequently the issues sort of merge into one, because you will find as time passes on, the more people who want a prime minister to leave office, they start using other issues as a proxy for that. So over time, and I think the government's probably finding now this time has sped up somewhat, but over time you'll see that those people who are just tricky on a number of issues grows exponentially. And you will know, just because of the other conversations that have been going on with the whips, that they're not happy with the leadership. So when, for example, say a Simon Hoare or a Julian Smith was unhappy with what Boris was doing on an issue, you would know that the part of the reason they were unhappy is because it's the broad direction of travel of the government or the personalities involved. So you keep track of it over time.
So you went through both the decline and fall of Theresa May and Boris Johnson. What advice would you give to those keepers of the spreadsheet right now? Is there any, once the sort of cat is out of the bag, is there any way of sort of shoring things up for a Prime Minister who's in trouble?
I think it's a very important job of the Whip's office. They've got to be a conduit in both directions, and I'm sure the Chief Whip understands that, but they've got to speak truth to power in number 10 and say, look, guys, we've got an issue here. You've got to listen. And equally, they've got to transmit the message from number 10 back to the parliamentary party. And that can sometimes be very difficult, because you feel as a whip's office, you're probably, when you're speaking to number 10 or the department or whoever, you're a bit Dr. No-ish, because you're saying, no, you can't do this. Or have you spoken to these people? No, not ready yet. Roll the pitch a bit more. And you're a bit the Eeyore in the corner of the room. But hopefully they've learned that they've got to be in the room. If they're not having those conversations or they're not included, that is usually where disaster emanates from. And at the same time, they've got to turn round to the parliamentary party and say, in order to have a loyal and functioning party, it takes two to tango. You can't have an unwilling dance partner. So give the Prime Minister time, chance and space. She's made the changes. She's got a new Chancellor in. Let's see how the markets react. Let's slowly catch a monkey on this, because when any political party tears itself apart, the only party that benefits is whoever's in opposition. I remember watching, when I was much younger in my career, watching James Purnell coming out and resigning, or Jeff Hoon and Patricia Hewitt, I think it was, challenging or allegedly going to challenge Gordon Brown. And it was like, well, as a Tory, that's great for us. And we're now on the receiving end of that. And hopefully trying to be a bit, the Whip's office should be calm, collected, and be that voice of reason and providing that context to both sides, and just buying time. But equally, when it does come to it, delivering unpalatable messages to either side as well.
And is that a role of the Chief Whip when it happened with, because I mean, there's lots of talk about Graham Brady as the chairman of the 1922 going and telling the Prime Minister their game is up. Is that also a role for the Chief Whip? Is that what happened with Boris Johnson and Theresa May?
So I think it very, very much is. I mean, I wasn't in those conversations with I was in number 10 by the time Boris's administration came to a close. and the chief whip usually goes on in those meetings by himself into number 10. But they should constantly be feeding back and explaining that their messages are no longer getting through, that things are looking very difficult. It should, in my view, it shouldn't just be up to Graham Brady, because the whip's office as a whole, you've got 17 odd ministers there who are having conversations with their flocks about the state of their associations, feedback from members, the electoral politics, as well as the issues and the careers and the views of the party and all that kind of thing. So they're the ones who get the full 360 view. And if it's the chief whip who's not having those conversations with the prime minister, then it feels to me that would be a bit disjointed.
So just finally then, Simon, you've been around a long time. What are Liz Truss's chances?
I mean, it certainly looks that's a big question. Obviously, it looks very difficult at the moment, but things have looked difficult for prime ministers in the past. I mean, Boris went on a lot longer, that I think, after the original party stuff broke in the press, and it took an issue like the resignation of Chris Pincher to topple him. Theresa May, if you'd have said after the 2017 election, you're going to govern for 2 more years, everyone would have sort of been slightly incredulous at the thought of that at the time. This is unbelievable to make that prediction. So I guess I'm going to sit on the fence a little bit. But what I would say is it takes a lot for MPs to write letters. There's this constant speculation of how many letters are in. And given it is an anonymous process, you would think that would lead to more putting in letters than fewer. But it feels to me that they're still slightly reluctant to do that. So I don't think it's going to be as imminent as perhaps the journalists would like it to be, but that makes great stuff to report on in the meantime.
So, Simon, tell me about the Whip's spreadsheet. Who owns it? Who can see it? And what's on it?
Wow, that's a big question. I spent 6 years in the Whip's office, so and the spreadsheets never really changed during that time beyond the fluctuations within the parliamentary party, and over time you added more and more columns to it, but broadly it was done on an issue by issue basis, and those spreadsheets would be run according to what votes you had coming up. So they are usually tied to legislation or opposition days, and you broadly you have the name of the MP, you have various other bits of information about them, constituency, majority, who they backed in referendums or leadership campaigns, or all those kind of things. Who's second place in their constituency, and then the columns on the issue. So, are they supporting the government? Yes or no, and if not, why not? And what particular vote are you not supporting the government on, and why? And the way that would be populated is ahead of a big vote. All the whips would ring their flocks or text their flocks and say, "You're with the government," and they'd have that conversation. I'd have sent them a script in advance and saying these are the questions that we need covered off. And if for any reason somebody comes back and says, no, I'm not happy about X, you then go through a triage process of they'd maybe speak to a more senior whip, then maybe a junior minister, the bill minister, the Secretary of State, and then maybe eventually the Chancellor or the Prime Minister, depending on what the vote was. So it's really a way of mustering views, putting it in one place, and seeing if you have enough votes to get over the line ahead of the day itself.
So is there one master spreadsheet which you're just constantly adding columns to, or is it a different spreadsheet per issue?
The way I always did it would be a different spreadsheet per issue, purely because the number of votes you face, it would become pretty unwieldy pretty quickly. But that said, I'm the type of person, I'm sure people that are there now are the same, of you build up that institutional memory. You've almost got your own spreadsheet in your head that if you said an issue, and Brexit votes dominated the early part of my time in the Whip's office, and that's probably the best example of where you'd say, well, okay, we're doing this thing. Have you spoken to this group of people on one side, the Dominic Greaves, Jonathan Ginoglis, or have you spoken to, on the other side, the Jacob Rees-Moggs and the Peter Bones? And you'll just be tracking in your head their positions over time.
And I suppose during the time you had a small majority, no majority, a big majority, And I suppose that makes a big difference to how alarming it is to find one MP's unhappy on an issue. Maybe they could just find themselves elsewhere on the day of the vote. Whereas when things are much closer, suddenly it's all hands on deck. And collecting that information on absolutely everyone suddenly becomes vital.
Absolutely. I mean, when we had no majority and we were in with the DUP particularly, it was, you found that individual MPs had disproportionate power. But equally, and the old adage of you spend 90% of your time dealing with 10% of the people was very much the case. But largely, I would say that 90% of the parliamentary party realised, well, actually, we've got to tuck together on this, and we've got to stay together. Whereas when we had a larger majority after the 2019 election, very much that feeling of collectiveness dissipated a little bit, and MPs were like, well, actually, I don't matter as much on this one because you've got a majority of 80. I can do this thing, and suddenly you get 15 experienced MPs who are doing that. Your majority is not looking quite what it was, and you're expected to smash every vote out of the park. And being the government, you have to assume every opposition MP is going to turn up, and this is something that backbenchers don't always understand. You'll win a vote by, you'll say this is desperate, and you win by 50. They say, well, I'm not actually needed then, am I? And you're like, well, we didn't know they weren't all going to turn up. So it's one of those funny things.